In this video, we're going to focus on inserting, working, and using static meshes to construct our environment. We have a good structure already set up with the BSP brushes, and we're going to use them as a template, as a guideline for our static meshes. In the end, we're going to replace all of the BSP brushes with static meshes. Let's go ahead and save this map as a new version. This is going to be version 3 and static meshes. Next, it's a good idea to fly around your environment and find good camera angles and set them pressing Ctrl 1 all the way through 0. So you can press Ctrl 1, Ctrl 2, Ctrl 3, and so on. And Unreal Engine will remember your camera position inside the environment. So I'm going to press Ctrl 1 here and maybe fly over here. Press Ctrl 2, go to another place and find good angles, good perspectives. And then anytime I want to come back to that camera position, I just hit the 1 key, 2, 3, and the editor will remember that camera position. This is helpful for when you want to take work in progress screenshots. So once you set one position, and throughout the production you can take a screenshot here and there, and then you can see how your process and your environment has evolved from the BSP blockend all the way to the final environment. So later you can review and see your process, or you can post these on the forum or on your website, and the progress will be shown from the same angle. Next, you may want to look through your available static meshes for this project. You should have already done that before you start the blockend process, because static meshes will define the theme and what kind of environment you can create. By going in the content browser under static meshes, you can double click to open static mesh editor, and you can view your static mesh here, or you can just look at the thumbnails and see which ones are available to us. Now we already know what we are after, so let's go ahead and use these static meshes to construct this environment. The easiest way to start is probably with the walls or the floor. So let's go ahead and see what kind of floor or wall static meshes we have. Now we can filter by name and search static meshes. We don't have a lot, but we could just type in wall. It'll give us all the wall static meshes that contain the name wall in them. But we're just going to scroll down on the bottom. Let's go ahead and actually start with the floor. We have 150 width floor and 300. So we're going to use the bigger one. Let's go ahead, left click and drag right into our level. And let's go ahead, just pick a spot and let's begin position it. I want to position this right where it meets the wall. And don't worry about this flickering, because we'll delete this brush on the bottom. So once I position the first one, I simply hold down Alt, left click and drag and duplicate, and make sure it aligns to the grid and to this floor static mesh. It's very important that when we begin to construct the environment using static meshes, that we have the grid snapping enabled. But up here in the perspective viewport, you want to make sure that you have grid snaps set to on. This is very important. And also you can change the grid size to a larger value or a smaller value. When we block in these static meshes, or when we use BSP brushes, you want to keep the grid around 10, maybe 50. And you should lower the grid to 5 or 1 when you're doing detail work. But try to avoid going down to lower snap sizes. Keep it around 50 or 10. We're going to set ours to 10 and make sure we have snapping enabled. And let's go ahead to top view. And I just pressed Alt J to switch the perspective viewport to top viewport. I'm going to select both of these static meshes, hold down Alt, left click and drag, and duplicate it. And I'm going to do this again and again. Actually, let's select all these 4 and let's duplicate them. Let's jump back to perspective. And let's go ahead and delete this floor. Now we got our static meshes positioned. I'm going to select the floor by left clicking and hit delete. Let's go ahead and grab these 2 right here and duplicate them. Let's go to top view again. Make sure they're lined up and snapped to each other. Let's go back to the top and take these two and duplicate them again. I'm going to stop with the floor here, and I'm not going to continue with the hallways because the length of the hallway will depend on the walls. We have a few walls, we have a few doorways, and I want to see how they're going to be used together before I even attempt to go and add static meshes for the hallways. Let's insert some walls and columns, and I'm going to show you a few options that you have and how to use them. In the content browser, here we have a couple of columns that's 100 units high, and we have another one that's 300. So let's go ahead and drag the taller one. Then let's go ahead and scroll down, and we have few walls that we can use. Wall 100, then we have a few half walls of 150 and full walls of 300. And these two are 150, which are just half of the measurement of the full walls. So we're going to first focus on our focal point, which is this main hallway. And whichever wall you want to use, that is up to you. But having two different kind of walls just gives us a little variety for our environment. So for the main hallway, I'm going to use 300A. And in the perspective viewport, let's press Alt-3 to go to unlit mode. And let's take this wall, rotate it 90 degrees, and make sure it lines up with this floor and this BSP brush. Now let's go to top view to make sure they line up. Now these static meshes are modular, means that the floor, the walls, the ceiling, the columns, they all line up. So constructing environments with modular static meshes becomes a little easier because everything is going to be snapped together. Let's go ahead and take this wall and duplicate it. And let's go ahead and duplicate it one more time. Now we can begin to delete some of these BSP brushes. Remember, we're not trying to line up static meshes to the BSP brushes. BSP brushes are just a template for us to follow. So let's go ahead and select these columns. Left click to select, and let's hit delete. Press F11 to go to full view. Now we need two things. We need to position our column to go in between the walls, and we need an additional wall for the top. I think 300 units high walls for the main hallway is too low, so the height of the hallway is going to be a little taller than 300 units. So let's go jump back to content browser, and we have a wall of 150 and a wall of 100. So let's go ahead and drag both of these in here. Let's take a look at this wall. It's the same as the one that we have, and this one. So let's go ahead and drag both because we're going to see which one works best. So here we have a choice. What wall on top of this main wall do we want to use? Do we want to use this small 100 wall? Maybe we want to just extend it a little taller, or maybe we want to use this wall. So let's go ahead and position them and see what they look like. I'm going to rotate it. And let's rotate both of these 90 degrees again. And I'm actually going to jump to an orthographic view and position them this way. Here's one, and let's position this one. Let's jump back to perspective and make sure they line up. Let's make this one right here, and let's position this one right here. And now let's take this wall, rotate it again, orthographic view, move tool, and position it right up here. So now let's take a look. We have this wall. The ceiling is a little in the way, but we get the idea. We can use this wall or this, and I think this 100 wall looks the best. It adds a little bit more variety and it doesn't repeat the same pattern. This wall looks pretty good too, so we could have used this one, but let's go ahead and use this 100 wall. So you do have options of constructing this environment in a variety of ways using different static meshes. The outcome is going to be the same, but the pattern at which you use these static meshes can be a little different. So let's go ahead and take this wall and delete them. Now let's take this column and position it right between the walls. Let's rotate it, and let's go ahead, move it right in between the walls. And let's push it in. And now we're gonna need an extension of this column to cover the top. So let's go ahead and look for that. And here we have column 100. Let's go ahead, left click and drag into the level. And now let's go ahead and rotate it and position it. And we can just stay in the perspective viewport for this. Now at this point we have an option of how we want to use these columns right next to these walls. These two walls are lined up. They're also lined up to the floor, and when we have a ceiling, all of these three pieces will line up. If we use the column this way, we'll have to intersect this geometry with this column. And this actually will look pretty good. If we happen to use a different wall, let's say we were going to use wall 300, B. Let's go ahead and select these and replace them. And now if we use this column in the same way, we remove some of the detail, these rivets. If we intersect this column into the wall, and if we continue to duplicate it, we'll just remove that detail. And it may look good, but that little detail is very nice, and it breaks up the flatness of the wall. So another option that we have is to take these columns and just move them until they line up to the wall and don't intersect. And it's okay if geometry and static meshes intersect each other. As long as there's no noticeable flickering, you are free to intersect static meshes. And then we would take this static mesh and make sure it lines up to the column. And this looks pretty good. It makes our walls larger because the columns are not intersecting. But the problem comes is that we begin to break some of the modularity. So now this static mesh doesn't line up with the floor, and if we continue to duplicate it, we'll have to fill in some gaps of the floor and the ceiling not lining up exactly to the static mesh of the wall. So the option that you have is you can use these static meshes in a variety of ways, and how you use them is up to you. So the key is to use available static meshes in new and unique ways and make them fit to work in your environment. For this example, I am liking how the static mesh walls look when the columns are not intersecting. So I'm going to keep this as is, and we'll have to fix some of the inconsistencies of the static meshes not lining up later. So let's go ahead and select these two walls and replace them back to 300A. So I selected them. Let's go ahead and select 300A and replace. Let's jump back to full view. And now let's go ahead and move this over. Take these columns, make sure they line up. I'm just checking everything is good. And let's take this wall and make sure that it's lined up to this column. Now let's take this top wall, hold Alt. I'm also going to hold down Shift. So I'm holding down Alt and Shift and then left click and drag. And this will duplicate and move the view at the same time. And now let's take these columns and duplicate them for this corner. So we covered a lot of important topics on how to begin to work in your static meshes into your environment. In the next video, we're going to speed up this process and you will see the full workflow of replacing these BSP brushes with static meshes.